We need to get a little bit more background information on the Negroes of Philadelphia and understand who they were, how they got there, what they experienced, and how they responded. In Dr. Dubois's 1899 book, The Philadelphia Negro, he gives us some history to explore on the first Negroes introduced into the city as slaves, and then their gradual emancipation to become free people and all types of things in between, right? But here we go. The Negroes were brought here early, were held as slaves along with many white serfs. They became the subjects of a protracted abolition controversy and were finally emancipated by gradual process. The process of emancipation was long and drawn out, and a bit later he provides some insight on why it took so long. Although for the most part in a low and degraded condition and thrown upon their own resources in competition with white labor, they were nevertheless so inspired by their new freedom and so guided by able leaders that for something like 40 years they made commendable progress. So the Negroes of Philadelphia were down in the pit, but when they became free, they began climbing out of it quickly. And that's because they had good leaders, a vision, and a group of people who actually wanted to do it. And with that combination, in about 40 years, Dr. Dubois says that they made commendable progress. Meantime, however, the immigration of foreign laborers began. The new economic era of manufacturing was manifest in the land, and a national movement for the abolition of slavery had its inception. These immigrants were people from Germany and Ireland who came into the land to work in manufacturing jobs. And when you get Germans coming in, just know that competition is getting ready to rise because they were known to be competitive in many areas, especially in skilled trades and crafts. The lack of skilled Negro laborers for the factories, the continual stream of Southern fugitives and rural freedmen into the city, the intense race antipathy of the Irish and others, together with intensified prejudice of whites who did not approve of agitation against slavery. All this served to check the development of the Negro, to increase crime and pauperism, and at one period resulted in riot, violence, and bloodshed, which drove many Negroes from the city. The native blacks lacked skills to compete for the factory jobs. Remember, he mentioned the new economic era of manufacturing came into the land. Blacks weren't skilled in this area, but foreign immigrants were, namely the Germans and the Irish, which made them more desirable workers, and it's what attracted them over to this land. Now, rather than allow the blacks to work in these areas or learn the skills, they excluded them to drive them down into the pit. And on top of this, Dr. Dubois mentions that there was a continual stream of incoming blacks from the South and the rural areas into the city of Philadelphia, which contributed to the tension between the groups, and it increased the crime and poverty. Everyone was competing for housing and jobs, and the tension was thick in the air. The Irish, who back in the day used to hide in the thickets with the blacks to fight against oppression, they didn't want to do that anymore. These new arrivals, along with the whites who did not approve of emancipation, they expressed extreme prejudice towards the Negroes, which in one period resulted in riot, violence on their behalf, and bloodshed, and it caused many Negroes to get out of there. Economic adjustment and the enforcement of law finally allayed this excitement, and another period of material prosperity and advance among the Negroes followed. So after all the commotion, the economy shifted and likely expanded and became more diverse, which allowed Negroes to start once again climbing out of the pit and experience their second wave of prosperity and advancement. So everything was going good and working out for them. But watch this. Then came the inpouring of the newly emancipated blacks from the South and the economic struggle of the artisans to maintain wages, which brought on a crisis in the city, manifested again by idleness, crime, and pauperism. Here comes the blacks from the rural South, fresh off the plantation from way out there in the country, newly freed and making their way into the city. And as this wave began entering into Philadelphia, the city was already experiencing economic issues of keeping wages for the skilled workers. So many of those workers, they probably feared that the newly arriving Negroes were going to accept work for very low wages and then make them have to accept work for low wages as well, right? Bringing it down for everyone. So When the element of black Southerners came into the city and the pre-existing economic issues clashed, it brought the city into a crisis. And as a result, many Negroes became idle, criminals, and extremely poor. Thus, we see that twice the Philadelphia Negro has, with a fair measure of success, begun an interesting social development, and twice through the migration of barbarians, a dark age has settled on his age of revival. He described them as barbarians. The first migration, I believe he's referring to both the foreign immigrants, like the Irish, who became violent toward the Negroes, and also the newly arriving Southern Negroes who got into a lot of crime. The second migration of barbarians is referring strictly to the Negroes from the rural South that are coming into the city. Now understand that all of this occurred prior to the 1890s when this book was written. And these migrations do not include the Great Migration, which took place beginning in the early 1900s, right? What we're talking about now are these mini migrations into the city. So let's be clear on that, right? Because when the blacks flooded the cities during the 1900s, that was a different and much larger crisis that occurred than what we're talking about here. Now, back to the mini migration. Each time they, who Dr. Dubois describes as barbarians, came into the city, it somehow resulted in stopping the progress of the Negroes who were already there and climbing out. Or a dark age settled on his age of revival. The same phenomena would have marked the advance of many other elements of our population if they had been as definitely isolated into one indivisible group. Meaning if the Irish or other groups would have been lumped together as one single group that they could not escape from, and they had many elements of barbarians coming into a certain area, then they would have experienced the same outcome. That's what he's talking about. And this is important here because Dr. Dubois recognized that the society lumped all the people into one black category and made no distinctions between the members. And it just so happens that the lower elements are who monopolize the reputation of blacks. So the decent and good standing members, they share the same reputation. This is why we read in previous commentaries how certain Southern blacks came into certain areas where pre-existing blacks had already been, and when they began acting a certain way that the public didn't like, the governing bodies, they made rules that lumped all the people together who were categorized as blacks. So when they expelled them, they didn't differentiate between the good standing blacks and the ones that weren't. When they added curfews and they made it to where people had to have passes to come into certain areas, they didn't make a distinction between the ones who weren't causing the problems and the ones who were. Everybody gets lumped into the same thing, right? And it's the same thing today. The lower elements, who do in fact make up a significant portion of the group who identify as black Americans, we have to be honest. They're the ones who contribute the most to the reputation of being black, right? Not the ones who are doing well, are productive members of society, and are not into the raunchiness culture. They look at them as the exceptions. Oh, you're just someone who's different, right? You're not like the rest of them. That's how they respond to that, the other people. Right? That's one of the reasons why we had to move away from that identity altogether and create new culture. And now the goal is to bring the ones who want to change along with us, right? And leave the others behind. So as Earpois, we have transcended the idea of race, and we no longer believe in being lumped into a group just because we look similar, right? That was an idea created by the Europeans for the purpose of dominating people. The Earpois, we go off shared culture, character, and consciousness. We don't do the race thing. That's for all the other American folks who are still very emotionally tied to that concept, right? We've moved past that. But at the time of Dr. Dubois, the Negroes were not allowed to do that, right? They all kept getting lumped together. No differences of social condition allowed any Negro to escape from the group, although such escape was continually the rule among Irish, Germans, and other whites. The Irish, German, and white Americans, they had social mobility. They could start off poor, living in areas with crime, living amongst people in the lower realms, And through better education and work, they could move up and blend in with the other worlds within the society. And those of the rich brown skin could not, right? It didn't matter how many degrees they had or how professional they were still lumped into the category with the rest of the blacks and forced to live amongst them in the lower realms, right? You see? So everything that we have just covered was a summary of what we're going to talk more about. From here in the book, Dr. Dubois goes into more detail on the early arrival of brown-skinned people in the region as slaves. He talks a little bit about how the founder of the Providence of Pennsylvania, William Penn, and other early Quakers in 1682 were complicit in the enslavement of blacks, even though they preached ideas that were supposed to be against slavery. He discusses how the Germans who settled after them protested against slavery in 1688. But the Quakers, they weren't trying to hear that at the time. And they kept a steady supply of slaves coming into Philadelphia up until 1693. Then in 1696, the Friends or the Quakers began to actively engage in the movement towards abolishing slavery. He says that the moral shift was slow, but it was an unwavering approach that nearly took almost a century to accomplish. Then he goes more into detail on the journey of that and how some Quakers resisted the change and how penalties were implemented for the slaveholders and that were members of that organization, right? And so let's pick up here and see what the good doctor has to say. Very early in the history of the colony, the presence of unpaid slaves for life greatly disturbed the economic condition of free laborers. While most of the white laborers were indentured servants, the competition was not so much felt. When they became free laborers, however, and were joined by other laborers, the cry against slave competition was soon raised. This was a consequence of slavery in the land. The poorer people of European ancestry were the ones who felt it the most on that side, because they had to eventually compete with Negroes who were laborers that worked for free or for little money. And these type of laborers drive down wages and create fierce competition amongst people who want to get paid more for the same type of labor. So we know this made them upset. And this is one of the ways that the whites in the lower realms could be used as tools to keep Negroes in the pit. They directed their frustration at Negroes instead of the people that were most responsible for the system, right? That's why the planters and the big business people had to get the poor people to buy into the concept of being white. So the poor could feel themselves to be united with the rulers and then direct their frustration out on the blacks instead of everyone in the colony turning their attention to the people that were really controlling the system. Because those people were just using everyone to begin with, right? But they were smart and they knew that they had to win the poor Europeans on their side so they can keep the attention off of themselves and on the Negroes as the source of the problems. When by 1722 the number of slaves had further increased, the whites again protested against the employment of blacks, apparently including both free and slave. Here they go, lumping them all together again. And look at this. Instead of getting upset with the people that brought them over to the place, they got upset with the people who were forced to be there by no choice of their own. That's what the feeling of whiteness did to them. It blinded them, and it didn't allow them to think straight, because they should have been protesting against the owners, the slave traders, the employers, and so forth, right? The people that are setting up the slave system and the economy and running it in such a way. Not the Negroes who were forced to be there, right? How much sense does that make? The legislature endorsed this protest and declared that the custom of employing black laborers and mechanics was dangerous and injurious to the Republic. So we see the lawmakers back the protest. Consequently, the Act of 1726 declared the hiring of their time by Negro slaves to be illegal and sought to restrict emancipation on the ground that free Negroes are an idle and slothful people and easily become public burdens. And what was this doing? Blocking off the opportunities, ensuring that they stayed in the pit as slaves. It was keeping them back and making sure that everyone could position themselves to get ahead. As to the condition of the Negroes themselves, we catch only glimpses here and there, Considering the times, the system of slavery was not harsh, and the slaves received fair attention. Meaning slavery was not harsh compared to the dreaded Deep South, where they pick cotton and work outside all day in the hot sun, right? It wasn't harsh compared to that. It wasn't harsh compared to the extreme whippings that Negroes received in the South and being around the rugged and wild whites of the South. The North didn't have that real vicious type of slavery like much of the South did. So yeah, it probably could be described as not being harsh when compared to that. But understand that the South is where the vast majority of Negroes were, right? So let's understand that. We're talking about a relatively small group of slaves in the North at this point, right? Who Dr. Dubois says received fair attention. There appears, however, to have been much trouble with them on account of stealing, some drunkenness, and general disorder. So some got wild, according to the accounts. The preamble of the Act of 1726 declares that it too often happens that Negroes commit felonies and other heinous crimes, and that much pauperism arises from emancipation. That's what they claimed happened, you know? This act facilitated punishment of such crimes by providing indemnification for a master if his slave suffered capital punishment. Meaning if a slave was put to death for a crime, then the owner would be compensated for his financial loss. They were declared to be often tumultuous in 1693, to be found cursing, gaming, swearing, and committing many other disorders in 1732. In 1738 and 1741, they were also called disorderly in city ordinances. In general, we see among the slaves at this time the low condition of morals which we should expect in a barbarous people forced to labor in a strange land. Here he goes again with the barbarian talk. But it's a bit unclear to me who he's referring to exactly. He could be referring to the people from Africa who labored in the strange land, or he could be referring to their descendants that had already been stripped of culture and were basically just Negroes at that point, right? I don't know which one he's referring to, but either way, what he said was wild, wasn't it? The years 1750 to 1760 marked the culmination of the slave system in Pennsylvania and the beginning of its decline. By that time, most shrewd observers saw that the institution was an economic failure and were consequently more disposed than formerly to listen to the earnest representations of the great anti-slavery agitators of that period. Now they want to listen because the money wasn't coming in like they expected it to. And I've mentioned before that slavery was about resources and control. It was an opportunity that certain Europeans exploited to put themselves in a position to control lots of people and gain access to a lot of resources. And people who operate in that realm and have low morals, they're willing to do anything to get resources and to control people, right? But as they began to see that it wasn't as lucrative for them in Pennsylvania, their ears began to open a little bit more. Meantime, voluntary emancipation increased. Sandiford emancipated his slaves in 1733, and there were by 1790 in Philadelphia about 1,000 black freedmen. Here we go. Now was their chance to start climbing up the mountain from whence they had fallen. A school for these and others was started in 1770 at the instance of Benezet, and had at first 22 children in attendance. The war brought a broader and kindlier feeling toward the Negroes. Before its end, the Quakers had ordered manumission, and several attempts were made to prohibit slavery by statute. Finally, in 1780, the Act for the Gradual Abolition of Slavery was passed, which was over 80 years before the South finally emancipated their slaves. So the Negroes in Pennsylvania, they had a long head start. They still faced many problems afterwards, but it was a much different environment than being a slave in the South. This act, beginning with a strong condemnation of slavery, provided that no child thereafter born in Pennsylvania should be a slave. The children of slaves born after 1780 were to be bondservants until 28 years of age. That is, beginning with the year 1808, there was to be a series of emancipations. So we'll stop right here and pick up in the next commentary on the rise of free Negroes after emancipation and how they began climbing out of the pit. This will basically be a more detailed explanation on what we went over earlier. Remember, Dr. Dubois told us that there were two waves where Negroes had success. And in the next commentary, we're going to go over the first. And so with that being said, I thank you for your time and your participation. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.